Hey everybody, so today we are going to be working on our February 2013 watercoloring card kit of the month, and this month we're going to be coloring this cute Whimsy stamp image by Elizabeth Bell called Kaydance. She's super cute, and I've already stamped her on my Canson 140 pound watercolor paper, and I have used my archival jet black ink to do that. So let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to start out by doing my outlining first so that I don't accidentally touch any of the image after I've colored it. It's a lot easier for me to just do the outlining first. So for that I'm going to use weathered wood, and I've already squeezed my water brush and got it all damp, and I've tested it on the back of my hand, and it is, because I'm doing the outlining, it's a lot wetter than it normally would be. So, or you can also dilute your weathered wood on a piece of acetate or whatever you want to dilute it on and then use it. I'm just squeezed my brush an extra amount so I would have extra water on there. So I'm just going to start by laying down a little bit of color out here on the outside of my body. And every time my brush leaves the paper, I'm either getting more ink or I'm wiping it off. So now I just have water on my brush, and I'm just lightly going over that edge of the line that I just laid down and brushing it out here into my white space. Okay, so I'm going to, and I work in sections. I don't do it all at once because it'll dry and then you can't move the line around. So I'm going to move around up here by the girl. So I'm going to go up here by her little hair bow she's got going up there, her little hat band. Okay, and then I'm going to wipe my brush off. And then I'm going to use the water in my brush to wipe out here into the background. And just pull that line out here until it becomes, you know, paper. And I'm just going to continue doing that all the way around. So grab a little bit more ink. Come up here, lay it down underneath of her hat. I don't want to put too much down, because if you leave it sit there too long, the line you laid down on your paper will be permanent. You can't move it around as well as when it's still damp. Kind of get in here a little bit in between those flowers there. Okay, and let's go up here and do around her hat. So I'm going to do right around her hat. Maybe get a little bit in here in those flowers. Okay, and then we'll wipe that out here. And my brush is still pretty wet, so I'm not having to dilute my ink with some water. And if it's starting to feel dry, go ahead and give your water brush another squeeze or re-dampen it and test it on your hand. I have to squeeze mine multiple times while I'm doing my brushing. Okay, that looks pretty good for that side, so let's spin her around here and come up from the bottom. And I didn't go all the way down to the bottom of her boot because we're going to put some ground down there. And so there was no sense in me putting this color down there when we're just going to add some brown here in just a minute. Okay, so brush this out here. There's a little bit in between of her flowers there. Come up here and get by her hand. And right here in between her hand, go around by her arm. Get on this side of the flower. And I'm just using the ink I'm wiping away from her arm here to kind of go in between the flower petals and the leaves up here. Grab a little bit more. We want to get right in here. Get that space between her arm and her face there. And then I think maybe these flowers right in here I need to put a little bit more. So put a little bit in there, wipe my brush off, and then come back and work that around up here and around the outside. And my brush is collecting ink, so I'm going to wipe it off again and come back and spread that out just a little bit more. And I'm not worried that I got some, if you get some on your flowers while you're doing that, because we're going to paint those blue and we're going to cover it up. I just tried not to get too much on there. And I better put a little bit more up here where her hat is. And go around this flower. And same with these flowers up here. If you get some on there, that's no big deal, because we're going to paint those a little bit later dark blue. I just try not to make it too obvious, and just in case it was going to be a different color. Okay, so there we've got our outline started. So let's go down here and do the ground, and for that I'm going to need brown, so let me switch palettes. Okay, so for the ground it says here we're going to use old paper first. So I'm going to grab a little bit of my old paper on my ink brush here. And I don't want the ground to stop right underneath of her boot. I want it to go up a little bit, so I'm going to say it's going to start right there. And I'm just going to bring it over here. And I've run out of ink, otherwise I would wipe it off. And I'm just going to go back with just my water on my brush and feather that out. And I think I'll grab just a little bit more for this side over here. So again, we're just going to brush some on there and feather that out so that it becomes nothing out here in the paper. Okay, and then it looks like I'm going to add a little bit of shadows underneath of her boot, and for that I'm going to use the old paper again. So I've got me a piece of acetate here, and I've just taped it to a piece of cardstock so I can actually see the ink on there. And I'm just going to dip my brush into my old paper, and I'm going to stick some right here on my acetate. Then I'm going to wipe my brush off, and I'm going to dip it just a tiny bit on the end of my brush in the walnut stain. So I've got just barely any on there, and I'm just going to brush that right into my old paper that I've dabbed on my acetate sheet. And then I'm going to wipe my brush off, and we're going to use that ink that I just made to put some shadows underneath of her boot. So I'm just going to go in here with my color and dab some on. And then brush it out just a little bit. Lighten that little harsh line right there. I just want it to be darker where she's standing. Like that. But see how that added the shadow there underneath of her boot? And you could go in again, and if you didn't think that was dark enough, just add another little dot of the walnut stain to your mixed paint there, and just darken up even more. Or if you're really careful, we could take just a little bit of walnut stain on the end of our brush, so that I've got just a little dab there, and go in and still add a little bit more shadows on there with just the walnut stain on it. But it's all about layering. You just let it dry for a second, and then you come back and you decide if you want it to be that dark, or you want it to be, you know, you want to keep it light. But you got to look at it and say, I want to add a little bit more. So let's go do her skin. Okay, so for her skin, I'm going to change from my medium brush, which had a larger tip on it, to my yellow detail brush. And again, I'm going to give it a squeeze, and I'm going to test it out by rubbing it on the back of my hand to see if it's damp. I don't want it to leave a trail of water, but I want to feel that it's wet. So for skin, we're going to start with Tattered Rose. So I'm going to grab a little bit of that on my brush, and I'm going to start down here on her leg since it's just this little bitty area, and I'm going to put just a little bit right there on her leg. That way it can dry if I want to come back and add some more. And then we're going to come up here and let's add a little bit to her arm. So I'm going to lay down underneath of her hat, and then I'm just going to brush that little tiny bit I put underneath of her hat down here to her sleeve. And that looks good for a first coat, so we're going to let that dry. And then I'm going to come in here, let's do this arm. So again, I'm going to lay down where I want it to be darkest, so I'm going to lay down right along the edge of the bottom of her arm. I didn't have enough ink there, so I went and grabbed a little bit more. And then I'm just going to use that ink to pull up onto the top of her arm. And that one looks a little light, but that's okay because I'm going to come back and add another layer. So I'm going to go up here and add a first coat to her face. So I'm going to grab me a little bit of my tattered rose, come up here, and I'm going to use my brush right along the edge of her face and her neck because I want that to be darkest. And then I'm just going to use that ink I laid down to pull down into the rest of her face. Like that. That looks pretty good for first coat. So we're going to let that dry. So let's go add another little bit to her arm here. So I'm going to go right along the back side of her arm and then use that bit to brush up towards the top. And then this arm definitely needs a little bit more. So I'm going to add a little bit here along the bottom of her arm. Maybe bring a little bit up next to her sleeve right there. And then I'm going to use that to brush up towards the top of her arm. That looks better. Let's add another coat to her face. I'm going to get a little bit more down here in her chin area, or her neck. Come up here and add some to her back of her face, and then brush that up here onto her nose. Let me soften that just a little bit. And then our little leg down here on her boot looks a little dark, so it's still wet too. I must have had a lot on my brush. Let's wipe a little bit of that off, just a little bit. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm liking how that looks. So I'm going to add a little bit of shadows. And for my shadows, I'm going to mix tattered rose and tea dye. And I'm going to do it just like we did for the ground. I'm going to grab a little bit of my tattered rose and I'm going to put it on the acetate sheet. And then add just a little drop of my tea dye. But since I use that all the time, I already have it mixed in my ink palette in a well. So I don't have to mix it anymore. It's always ready for me to use. So I'm just going to grab a little bit of that mixed color and I'm going to come in and add some shadow. So I want to add a little bit of shadow here underneath of her hat, and I'm going to go down the bottom of her arm, and I'm just going to come back with just water and lightly brush that line. I'm not going to go clear up here to the top of her arm, but just soften that line just a little bit. Blend it in. And the same thing for this arm. I'm going to go right along the bottom of her arm, maybe a little bit underneath of her sleeve right there, and then I'm going to come back with just water and lightly trace along that line and just soften the edge of it. I don't want to bring it clear up here. It's just to add a shadow on the bottom of her leg or her arm there. And the same thing for her leg down here. I'm going to grab just a little bit and maybe put a little bit back here in this crease. And then soften that up just a little bit. And that's such a small area that I'm just going to wipe it clear to the bottom. I'm going to go up here and do her face. I want it to be dark underneath of her chin. And her hat's going to cast a shadow. And then do the back of her face. And again, you're going to go in with just your water and soften that line. There, she looks pretty cute. So she's going to have, also, while she's drying, let's go add, whoops, I need to have a little bit of a line right here on her arm, so let me soften that up just a little bit. Okay, so for her cheeks, we're going to use Worn Lipstick and Tattered Rose. So I'm going to go ahead and get my little acetate sheet out. And I'm going to grab, and you're not going to hardly need any paint whatsoever when you do her cheek. So I'm going to grab just a little tiny dab of my Worn Lipstick on my paintbrush and dab that on there. And then to not make it quite so pink, I'm going to grab some Tattered Rose and I'm going to mix that in there. I think it's going to need just a little bit more. So I'm going to mix those two together like that. And I'm going to use that for my cheek color. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure my brush is still wet. Grab a little bit of that cheek color, and I want her cheek to be right here. So I'm going to dab that on, and then I'm going to wipe my brush off, and I'm going to come back and just very lightly go over the edge of her cheek. My little circle that I put on there. And I'm going to let that dry, and if it needs some more, I'm going to put some more on there, but we're going to let that dry for a second. Alright, so I've let that dry for a minute, and see how light her cheek is now? So I'm going to go back and I'm going to grab a little bit more of my cheek color, and I'm going to add some more onto her cheek here. And it might be too that I just diluted my Worn Lipstick too much, so I'm going to grab a little bit more of that and mix it back on my palette again. And then grab a little bit of that and dab it in here. Darken her cheek up just a little bit more. She wants to have rosy cheeks. And I'll go in here and soften the edge of that line. Okay, I'm liking how pink that is. So I'm going to leave that for a minute and let that dry and work on her hair. And then I'll come back and I'll add another coat of Tattered Rose over her face to soften up that harsh lines on the edge of her cheek. So for her hair, we are going to use Scattered Straw. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my medium brush so that I can have more brush area to work with. I'm going to grab a little bit of my Scattered Straw on my brush, and I'm going to lay down where I want it to be the darkest. So again, I want it to be darkest underneath of her hat. So I'm going to lay right down along her hat right there. And it kind of dips in right here, so I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit right there. And then right here it looks like it kind of curls up, and this would be underneath. So I'm going to add that. And then I'm going to brush my, wipe my brush off, and I'm going to go up here and I'm just going to use the water in my brush to pull this Scattered Straw down along her hairline, all the way, covering her whole hair up, down here to the bottom. Okay, and I'm going to wipe my brush off because it's still, to me, kind of yellow. So I'm going to go up here again, start at the top, and I'm going to brush my brush all the way down, pulling ink from the top clear down to the bottom of her little curly Q there. Like that. So now it's got a nice light yellow tone. So let me see if her cheek is dry here. Okay, it looks like her cheek is dried a little bit. It's dried pretty good. So I'm going to switch back to my detail brush. And I'm going to grab just a little bit of just plain Tattered Rose on my brush, and I'm going to just add a little bit here on the side of her face, and then I'm going to use that to brush out here clear to the edge of her face, and that will soften up her little cheek so it doesn't have quite such a large line there on the edge right here. Okay, I'm liking how her cheek looks now, so I'm going to leave that. So it looks like on her hair, I also used brushed corduroy to add a little bit of shadows. So I'm going to grab that ink palette. And then I'm going to keep my detail brush because I don't want to use quite so much brushed corduroy. I just want to add some shadows in here. So I want to have some shadows underneath of her little headband right here, or her do-rag, or whatever we call that. And I'm going to brush that right along her hairline, and then I'm just going to go in with just my water and pull that line down and soften it. Like that. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing down here. So let's do right here where her little curly Q brushes, it like curls under. So I'm going to add a little bit of my color right here where it curls under, and then I'm going to wipe my brush off. And then I'm going to use just the water in my brush, and I got quite a bit of paint there, so I'm going to wipe it off again and pull that up here into her hair. Oops, and it looks like maybe this little curlicue right here was supposed to be background. So let me wipe that with a little bit of water. And I'll put a little bit of blue right there here in just a little bit. Okay, that cleaned that up. Dab it with my paper towel. Let's add some more. Let's do right here where this one looks like it kind of curls up. Right here where it's touching it would be a little bit darker, so I'm going to add a little bit in there and then brush that up here into her little hair up here. And I think I'll add a little bit on this little curlicue right here where it's curling back under. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then it looks too like this one kind of curls in the back, so I'm going to add a little bit right there where it curls under, and then bring that ink over here into the onto her hair to dispense some of that darker color. Okay, and I think I'm going to add a little bit more up here underneath of her hat. I'm going to add a little bit right there along her hairline, and then come in with my brush and I'm going to pull that line a little bit further down into her hair. Like that, but see how it adds just a little bit of shadows in there? I think I'm going to go back and add maybe just a little bit right here again in this little crease. Maybe darken that up just a little bit more. And pull that up here. But that had some shadows there where it dips and curls right there. So that looks pretty good. So next let's go work on her hat. Alright, so for her hat it looks like we're going to use antique linen. And since I've got quite a big area right here, I'm going to switch to my medium brush. And I'm going to grab a little bit of antique linen on my brush. And I'm going to add that where I want it to be the darkest. Let me turn my image here just a little bit. And I want it to be darkest along the bottom of my hat. So I'm just going to lay down a little line of my ink. I'm going to wipe my brush off. And I'm going to come back and brush that ink up towards the top of this rim right here. Okay, then I'm going to grab a little bit more. And this little fold right here is going to have a little dark area, so I'm going to add a little bit of my antique linen in there, and then I'm going to go in with just my water and brush it up towards the edge. And the same for her hat up here. I'm going to add a little bit here along the crown, or along the base of her hat. And she's got a little bit in there where the flowers, you can see her hat through the flowers, so I'm going to kind of brush a little bit in there. And then we'll wipe my brush off, and then I'm going to use that ink to spread up here towards the top of her hat. So I want it to be lighter along the edges, but not quite so light here at the top in the cracks. So she's got a little dip right here in her hat. I'm going to go ahead and add some color in there. And I think I'm going to put just a little bit more right here in this seam right here. And maybe a little bit along this edge. So I like how it's a little bit darker down here, but it's kind of a light color right up here. That looks pretty good. So while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and mix up my antique linen with some gathered twig. So I'm going ahead and grab me a little bit of my antique linen onto my brush, and I'm going to dab that onto my acetate sheet. Wipe my brush off. Grab some gathered twigs on the end of my brush, so I've got a little bit of that on there, and I'm just going to swirl that in here with my antique linen, like that. And then I'm going to clean my brush off because I don't want to have any of that excess ink on there. And then it looks like her hat's still a little bit wet. So while that's still drying, I'm going to go down here and I'm going to add a layer of antique linen to her boots. I kind of skip around when I'm coloring. So for her boots, I didn't do these little, the top of her boot or the little band here. I did that pink later. But I'm going to do the inside. So I'm going to go ahead and run my ink down my boot, around the back. Wipe my brush off and then wipe this towards the center here. And I'm not worried about those, the little hearts ropes there on her boot because I'm going to make those a darker color. So I don't mind that I've now painted them a light tan color. Okay, same for this boot. We're going to go down the inside of her boot. Maybe get a little bit in that little crack. And then just use that ink to color out here towards the edge. So now they're a nice light tan color. So now while we've been painting that, our hat has dried. So let's go up here and add some shadows to our hat. So I'm going to take my mixed antique linen and my gathered twigs. I'm going to grab a little bit of that on my brush. And you're going to add it where you want it to be the darkest. So I want my hat to be darkest along the bottom here. So I'm going to wipe some of my ink on there. And I'm going to come back and I'm going to brush over that line and soften it. But since I've came all the way across, I picked up quite a bit of ink, so I wiped it off. And I'm going to come back and continue. My line's still a little too harsh, so I'm going to come back and wipe on that line again and wipe it up here towards the top. So it gives it a nice shadow. And then I'm going to do, I need a little bit right here in this little seam. Wipe my excess ink off. Come in and soften that line up. And we want to get the top of her hat. So we're going to go in here, a little bit in the flowers there. Come back and brush that up here towards the top of the hat. And remember, if you get too much ink on your brush, wipe it off and then come back. That way when you get clear up here at the top of her hat, it's a lot lighter than it was down there at the bottom. But there, that added just a nice little shadow. So let's do the same down here for her boot. So I'm going to grab a little bit of our mixed paint, and I want her boot to be darkest along this edge where it's touching the other boot. And just lightly brush that line. Like that, and that added a nice shadow in there. Now let's go ahead and do the back of this boot with a little bit in the bottom here. Add just a little bit. Maybe dab a little bit in those little hearts. Maybe needs just a little bit more. Okay, that gave it a nice shadow on the back of the boot. I think that looks pretty good. So let's go up here. I'm going to let that dry for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to go do the little, her little do-rag here on her hair. All right, so let's go up here and do this little bandana she has on her head. And so I've switched to my detail brush because I don't want to get any color on these little circles that she's got on her hat. I just want to color the inside part. And so I'm going to grab me a little bit of black soot on my paintbrush, and I'm going to start actually down here on this little tie. So I'm going to put down a little bit of my black soot, and I'm just going to work that black soot down to the end of her tie, trying to miss that little circle she's got on there. And then when we get to the bottom, I'm going to wipe my brush off, and I'm going to grab a new dot on the end of my brush, and I'm going to go to the other side and brush down along that little bow tie. And it's pretty puddled. You probably can't see it on camera, but it's still got quite a bit of a puddle there, so you're going to have to let that dry. So I'm going to go up here and I'm going to grab me a little bit more, and I'm going to start up here underneath of her hat, and I'm going to go around that little dot, and I'm going to pull it down here towards the bottom of her little cap there. And then I'm going to work my way back up, and I'm just spreading that line towards the middle of her hat. And it's starting to change color. See how it's lightening out into a little bit of a lighter black color as it gets closer to the front. And my brush has picked up quite a bit of water, so I'm going to wipe my brush off, and then I'm going to continue with my water that is already on here, my paint, brushing it towards the front. Okay, and I'm going to want to darken that up just a little bit, but I'm going to let that dry because it's really damp because my brush was pretty wet. And I'm going to go down here and we're going to add a little bit of color to this puppy. So since he's black too. So I'm going to grab a little bit of my black soot on my brush, and I'm going to just put a little bit of black soot right there along her boot, but on my puppy. And then I'm going to use that ink I laid down to brush out here onto his body, onto his foot. Okay, and then I'm going to wipe my brush off. It's getting pretty wet. And I'm going to grab a little bit more. I'm going to go add a little bit right here beside his ear. And then I'm going to wipe the excess paint off my brush. And then come in, and I've got quite a bit there, so I'm going to wipe my brush off yet again. And then just brush that ink over here onto the rest of his face. Like that. Alright, so that looks like that has dried nicely, but I think I'm going to go up here and add just a little bit more to her little hat. So I'm going to grab a little bit of my black soot on my brush. I want to darken it up right here where it comes closest to her hat. And I'm just going to brush that line a little bit down here. And bring it down until it runs out. Because I'm okay with it being lighter in here, because it kind of looks like the sun is kind of shining a little bit on there and giving it a little bit of a highlight right here in the middle part. So I'm liking that. I'm going to leave it just like that. And I'm also liking how the dog turned out, so I'm going to leave him. No, I'm not going to leave him. I'm going to add, I need to add a little bit of black, I think, to his ears. So I'm going to go up here and add just a little bit of my black soot to his ear and wipe it off, and then come in here and brush it down to further on his little ear here. That way it's darker at the top, but not quite so dark at the bottom. I'll fix his face maybe just a little bit there too. Okay, now let's let him dry. So while those are drying, let's go work on these flowers in her, on her hat. And it looks like for that I used flowers, chipped sapphire. So let me grab some of that, open that ink palette up, and grab a little bit of chipped sapphire on my end of my brush. And I'm going to do multiple flowers, so I think I'll start with the darker flower back here in the back. And these flowers have like a little circle in the middle, so I'm going to try not to color the circle. And I'm just going to go around the circle with my chipped sapphire. Same for this one. Okay, and then I'm going to wipe my brush off, and I'm going to come in with just the ink I put down there and brush it out towards the outside of my flower. And if your area gets to be too wet, just wipe your brush off and then come back and move that around just a little bit more. So I'm going to wipe mine off, and I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to do the same thing for these other two. I'm just pulling that ink out here onto the rest of my petals. And they're pretty wet, so that's going to take a few seconds to dry. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go over here and do the same thing to this side. So I'll grab a little bit more of my chipped sapphire, and I'm going to dab a little bit maybe on there. Maybe I won't put quite so much on this side. We just do a little bit, and then wipe my brush off so I have less ink to work with, and that way the flowers will be lighter. So I'm just going to go in and move that ink I laid down around on my flower. That. Same thing for this one. And this one's way out here in the front, so I don't have quite as much on there. So it's going to be a lot less blue. And then she's got a couple down here in her hand. So let's go ahead and paint those. I'm just going to put a little dab on each of these little petals. And then wipe my excess off, and then come back and spread that little dab further out onto my petal. And sometimes it runs out of ink and it's like a light white color at the end. I don't mind that. But it's totally up to you. But once you start spreading your ink out, if you want to come back and add more, let it dry, and then come back and add some more blue. You don't want it to be wet when you're adding another layer on there. Move my ink around a little bit. Those look pretty good. So let's go and add some color too. There's some leaves on here too, so I'm going to go ahead and paint those. So those are peeled paint. So I'm going to grab a little bit of peeled paint on my brush, and here's a leaf. So I'm going to brush some on there, and there's a leaf. Whoops, and I think that was a flower, so let's paint that. Right here's a little flower. And I'm back to my peeled paint. So there's a couple little leaves over here. And here's some right here. And then she's got the ones on her flowers down here. Brush some of that on my petals. Okay, and then I'm going to wipe my brush off, and for the stems I'm going to grab a little bit more on there so I have the concentrated, it's the darkest, and then just very lightly, just the end of my paintbrush, and I ran out of ink so I've got to grab a little bit more. Just go right along those stems. And they're pretty small, so you got to be careful. You could also use your distress markers if you have those. Those would be perfect for in here. I just haven't mastered the technique for using them to paint the whole image yet. It just never looks good. It always looks like yuck. So I prefer to use the re-inkers when I paint mine. Okay, so that's our flowers. Those are all looking pretty good. So it looks like next we're going to move on to her dress. But before we do that, let's do the sole of her boot. That way it can be drying. So when we get down to her boot, we won't have to worry about that, messing that up. So for the soles of her boots, I'm going to use walnut stain. So I'm going to grab a little bit of walnut stain on my brush, and I'm just going to do the very bottom of her boot. Right along the edge here. Because the top of the top part up here is going to be pink. Okay, so just like that, we're going to let that dry. So let's do her dress. Okay, so for her dress, we're going to use spun sugar for our light pink coat. So I'm going to switch to my medium brush because this is a huge area I want to cover in. So I'm going to grab some spun sugar onto my brush, and I'm going to start here underneath of her arm. I'm just going to lay down my spun sugar underneath of her arm, and I'm just going to pull that spun sugar down here into the bottom of her dress, giving it a nice light pink coat. I've picked up some kind of something there on my dress. fuzz. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and go up here and do the same thing for up here. So I'm going to go right above her arm. I'm going to dab a little bit on this sleeves there. Then I'm going to wipe my brush off. And I'm going to use that pink just to pull up here onto her dress. And she's got a little bit of a skirt poking out over there, so I'm going to grab that. Okay, that looks pretty good, but I think I'm going to add just a little bit more to the bottom of her skirt right here. So I grabbed a little bit more of my spun sugar, and I'm just going to again lay it down underneath of her arm, so as I want it to be darkest up here, and then I'm going to use that ink and pull down onto her dress so that it turns it a nice light pink down here towards the bottom. Like that. That looks pretty good. Okay, so we're going to let that dry. So while that is drying, it looks like we need to color this dog's tongue. So let's use a little bit of worn lipstick for that. And I'm going to grab my detail brush because it's got a smaller end, and paint my dog's tongue. And then it looks like also I should have used my walnut stain maybe on his fur. So let me grab that. Switch ink palettes here. So I'm going to grab just a little bit of my walnut stain on my brush. And I still have the detail brush. And I'm going to paint the end of his little tail here. So I'm going to add a little bit on his tail. And then he's got a collar. And he's got this little fluff, I'm going to call it a fluff of hair right there. And his little hair on his head. And then I'm going to wipe my brush off. And I'm going to come in and soften that. Like that. So it adds a little bit of brown to it. And then you can let that dry and you can come back and decide if you want to add a little bit more. And it looks like I should have maybe put a little bit of color back here in the back of his throat too there. So that's our dog. He looks pretty cute. Okay, so let's go up here and work on our dress some more. And for the rest of our dress, we are going to use spun sugar and festive berries mixed together. So I've went ahead and I've mixed that onto my palette. And I'm going to, while the dress is still drying, I'm going to go ahead and do her boots. So I'm going to use my mixed paint for my boot. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to add that right where I want it to be darkest. So like that. And then I'm going to just brush both of those towards the middle so that the top right here in the center is going to be a little bit lighter. And then I'm going to grab a little bit more. I'm going to do the same thing over here on this side. Maybe add a little bit like that. Wipe my brush off. And then pull that both towards the middle. Grab some more. Let's do the same thing down here. Make sure your walnut stain is dry or you're going to get some brown mixed in there. Let's do this boot over here. Okay, and then I'm going to let that dry and I'm going to come back and maybe add another layer on there. Okay, so let's go work on our dress. So I'm going to grab some of my mixed paint and I want to add a little bit of shadows back here on the back of her sleeve. And she's got some great little pleats in there, so I'm going to add a little bit on there. And then I'm going to come back with just my water. And I'm collecting quite a bit of ink, so I'm going to wipe my brush off in the middle there. And I'm just going to lightly pull that up towards the top of her sleeve. So I've got this nice shadow on the bottom. And then the same for this other sleeve. I'm going to go right along her dress. And then I'm going to wipe my brush off. And I'm going to use just the water to pull that area out here towards the edge of her sleeve. So that also made it have a little bit of a shadow area there closest to her dress. And then I'm going to do this little piece on her dress there on the top. I'm just going to color that all the way in, and here on the side I want the part with the lace to be lighter. And then I also want to darken up these sleeves bands. And she's got a couple little bows, so I'm going to color those. And you could leave them white or the light pink too. I'm just going to paint mine that darker red color. Okay, and then let's go down here and do her skirt. So for her skirt, I want to add some color to these lines. So I'm going to go with my pen and my paintbrush, and I'm going to add a little bit of color to the line like this. And then I'm going to wipe my brush off. I don't want to do too many at a time. And then I'm going to come back with just the water in my brush and soften the edge of the line, pulling it up onto the rest of the skirt. I got a little bit on the underskirt there, though. Let's wipe that off. Okay, so that pinked it up just a little bit. I'm going to probably come back and do a little bit more on those in a bit, but I'm going to let that dry. So I'm going to come up here, I'm going to go to the next line. I'm just going to work my way along. Again, wipe my brush off. And then come back and pull that line up here to my white. So I'm turning, my dress is turning pinker, but it's still pretty light at the top. Okay, we'll go down and get the next couple of lines. Whoops. Pull that up here towards the ruffle. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, let's go do a couple more. So let's get this one, and this one, and that one. I try to do just a couple, 2 or 3 at a time, so it doesn't have a chance to dry. And I've got quite a bit of ink on my brush, so I'm going to wipe it off. Oops. Come in here and dab that line just a little bit more. Let's work on the next one. So we're going to go right like that. Wipe off my excess, and then come in with just water and brush that line out. Almost the other side. A little bit more on this side. Being careful to go around that green stem. I got it when I was doing the spun sugar, and I turned the dress just a tad bit green there. I want to get on this side. Okay, that looks pretty good for a first coat. So I'm going to let that dry. I'm going to go down here and add just a little bit more to some of my boot down here. So I'm going to add a little bit more to this boot. I want it to be darker. I want to be able to see the pink on those boots. Okay, that looks pretty good. So I'm going to let that dry for a second, and I'm going to add a little bit more of my festive berries to my mixed paint so we can get a darker shadow. Okay, so I let that dry for a couple of minutes. Now I'm going to go back in, and I want to add a little bit deeper shadows to my dress. So I added a little bit more of my festive berries to my mixed paint, so it would darken it up just a little bit more. So I'm going to grab a little bit of that, and I just want to define a few of these lines a little bit better. So I'm going to come in here and just define a few of these. And I'm very lightly going along the edge of that paint, and then I'm wiping my brush off and I'm coming back and I'm going along it again, and I'm just going to soften that until there's not a line there anymore, but it pulls it out here into the edge of her dress there just a little bit. So like that. Let's see how much darker that looks. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next couple of lines. So I'm going to grab a little bit more paint. I'm going to go down this line. I ran out of paint on that one, so I'm going to grab a little bit more and go down that line, and then wipe my brush off, and then come back and just lightly tap along that line, soften it up, and then I'm going to wipe my brush off because I gather quite a bit of ink when I'm doing that. Okay, I'm liking how those two look. So I'm going to grab a little bit more. And I think I'm going to go back here and I better do these ones back here just a little bit. Right along that one. And that one kind of is hidden behind her hair, so I'm not too worried about that one. But I better put a little bit on this one right here, just a little bit. I got some on the front of my pleat there. Wipe that off. Kind of darken that up behind her hair there so it's not quite so light. Okay, so let's move over here to the front of her dress again. I'm going to go right down that one and down this one because it looks like this pleat maybe tucks up and then this one rolls over right here. Okay, let's go down the center of this one right here, clear to the bottom, and darken that whole pleat up. Adds a little bit of a shadow in there. And then let's go down this one, and I'm kind of going underneath of her arm all the way across so that, because her arm's going to cast a shadow on there, and I'm just going to darken that up just a little bit more. So it looks like there's a shadow where her arm is following. And I missed this one right here, so let's add a little bit right there. I'm trying to get them all as I go clear across here. Okay, I'm going to grab some more ink, and then let's move right along to the next little fold. Okay. Wipe your brush off. Come back. Soften. Get more, continue across, come back and soften, being careful of that green stem again, and then she's got a couple more over here on this side. Don't forget those two. I forgot them the first time I colored her. I'm like, what's it got clear to the end, and I'm like, what in the heck is that thing? I'm like, oh, that's her skirt. Okay, I'm liking that. But see how just adding a little bit more of that festive berries darkened up our shades just a little bit? And then on her boot down here, she's got these great little lasso hearts. So I'm going to grab a little bit of my mixed paint on my brush, and I'm just going to carefully, because they're pretty dinky, use just the end of my brush to paint each of those little ropes. And I've run out of ink, so I'm going to go ahead and wipe all the excess off of my brush, the water. I'm going to grab a little bit more and come back and add some more on top because it goes clear down here to the bottom. Like so. Alright, so we have colored our entire girl. She looks really good. You could look at it if you've decided, if you've let it dry in between and you've added all the shadows you want, we are done. I love my girl the way she is, so let's put her together. Okay, so I have my assortment of stuff from my kit here, and I'm going to put things together. And since I don't have anything underneath anything else this time, I can just go ahead and start gluing things down. So I'm going to attach my girl to her mat. Stick her down there. I got a few fuzzy pieces on my mat here, so let's run my hand around here and get rid of those. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and add her white dot to her cheek with my Sharpie paint pen. So I'm going to shake that up. And I'm just going to give her a dot like that on her little cheek. See your little dot? Okay, let's put the rest of this stuff together. I'm going to set her over there so she can dry. Okay, so it looks like I've got this black piece. I'm going to attach that to the base. Put that right on here. And then next comes this little red piece with the white dots. Oh, and it has a great little sign on the back, but each piece probably doesn't have that because I think this piece only had a little section where it had the little saying on the back. Although I like the pink stripe paper that was on the side of it. Okay, and I don't have it straight on my card, so I'm just going to offset it like so. And then next comes this little piece with the hearts. And this one's not straight either, so I'm just going to set it on there and go whoop. And then next comes this black and white checked piece. Or I guess those are squares. I guess it's probably how about gingham? I think it's called gingham. Okay, and that piece isn't straight either, so let's just pick a spot and be like, yep, that looks pretty good. And then we have the love words. This is really cute paper. And that one is offset over here, not straight. Like that. And then our girl has some pop dots on her, so I'm going to go ahead and pop her up real quick. Well, okay, not so quick. Seems like these pop dots never want to come off the page the way they should. And it's even harder to get the glue stuff off the tape off the back. Okay. And then she is going to go whoops, right about how about right here? That looks like a good spot for her. And then she has, her kit this time comes with some ribbon and some twine and a button. And so to save time, I have already made my bow on the Bow Easy, and I ran my twine through the button and tied it onto this bow. And for that, I'm going to take a glue dot and put a glue dot on the back of my bow. And I'm just going to stick that to my card like that. And then I'm just going to foof up my bow here, make it kind of messy. So like that. And then there's some flowers. So you got a couple of medium flowers, a large flower, and a small flower. So I'm going to take the large flower and a medium flower, and then a medium flower and a small flower, and we're going to attach those. So So let's go ahead and stick this red flower onto the pink flower. And you can offset them or make them straight or do however you like that. And then same for this side. I think I'll turn it just a little bit more. Okay, while I still have them flat, I'm going to go ahead and put some tape runner on the back here. And then to give my flowers a little bit more dimension, I like to take my paintbrush and I just stick it underneath each of the petals and then just kind of roll the petal over the edge of the paintbrush. Just like this. And for the bigger petals, I try to go further up onto the paintbrush handle. If they were really dinky petals, then I would use the very end. I just roll them like so. And these petals have a few little foofs on them, so I'm going to pick that off. Okay, and we're going to put this one, how about right here. Okay, and we're going to do the same thing for this one. I'm going to take how small these petals are, so I'm just going to roll those onto the end of my paintbrush and just roll them just a little bit. And that flower has a bunch of foof stuff on the end too. I needed to maybe brush my flowers a little bit with my finger before I stuck them together. Okay, and this one, the back petal, I'm going to roll my paintbrush up just a little bit further on the handle so that it has a bigger loop at the end. Okay, I'm going to stick that one right here. Okay, and then your kit comes with some great, these little Bella Bling pearls, and they already have sticking on the back and a little pop dot, so you just have to pull them off and stick them on there like that. And that is our card this month. So I hope you had fun, and we'll see you next time. Have a great day.